London's rain fell in a steady, deliberate rhythm against the window pane as Amelia Price sat curled on the armchair in her modest Notting Hill flat. The sky outside was a dull pewter gray, the kind of London afternoon that blurred hours into each other. A half-read novel rested in her lap, forgotten the moment the knock came at the door. No name, no courier badge, just an envelope slipped under the door like a secret. She stared at it, hesitant, her fingers brushing the thick ivory paper that somehow already felt like bad news. With a quiet breath, she picked it up and carefully opened it. A single sheet of elegant cardstock slid into her hand, bordered with gold, scripted in calligraphy that mocked her with its grace. Her eyes scanned the words, and her chest tightened. Edward Price requests the honor of your presence at his wedding to Isabel Montgomery this Saturday at Claridge's Ballroom, 7 p.m. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reread the name, Edward. Her husband. Or at least, the man who had once called himself that. A man who vanished 3 years ago with nothing more than a vague text about needing time and space. There was never closure. No formal divorce papers. No explanation. Just the cold vacuum of silence and the occasional news article about Edward's booming tech firm and his stylish new companion who always lingered close in photographs, Isabel Montgomery. Amelia stood slowly, her heart racing with a strange blend of rage and clarity. The injustice stung, but it was the audacity that burned. He had not even divorced her. Had he forgotten she existed? Or had he assumed she would stay buried in his past, too broken or too polite to ever rise again? As the clouds thickened outside, Amelia moved to the mantel and picked up an old photo of their wedding day. She stared at the version of herself who once believed in fairy tales, her lace veil catching the golden light of a different London. Then she looked at the woman in the mirror now, quieter, yes, but stronger. More awake. The silence she had lived in was finally cracking. She slid the invitation back into its envelope and placed it neatly on the table beside her. Her voice was quiet, steady, certain as she whispered, "He thought he erased me. I'm about to remind him who I am." 5 years ago, beneath a canopy of white roses in a sun-drenched Hampshire estate, Amelia Price had stood hand in hand with Edward, promising forever. She had never been more certain of anything in her life. Edward had been charming, ambitious, brilliant, the kind of man who walked into a room and made you forget your name. They were the picture of a perfect English couple, her in an elegant silk gown, him in a tailored navy suit, 1,000 smiles frozen in photographs, 1,000 whispered promises exchanged beneath the stars. Their vows had felt eternal. And Amelia, foolishly perhaps, had believed in every single one. In the early days, they were inseparable. She left her job in publishing to support his dreams. Long nights were spent planning his startup's branding, pitching ideas, proofreading proposals, preparing investor decks. She made their flat feel like a home while he turned their dining table into a war room for innovation. They celebrated each tiny victory with Chinese takeout and clinked wine glasses at midnight. She gave him everything, time, love, loyalty, never once asking for anything in return. She believed that success would one day circle back to both of them. But success arrived like a silent storm. Edward's startup exploded into a tech darling overnight, and with it, so did his world. Suddenly, there were endless meetings, private jets, whispers of acquisitions, and weekends lost to urgent strategy retreats. Amelia, once his sounding board, became a placeholder at dinner. The warmth in his eyes faded, replaced with blank stares and muttered excuses. He would return late at night, his cologne changed, his phone always turned face down. He stopped asking about her day. Eventually, he stopped speaking at all unless it involved schedules or logistics. The man who once kissed her forehead before every meeting now barely offered a nod in passing. Then came the message, one line on a Wednesday morning. "I'll be filing for divorce. We'll sort it out soon." No explanation. No conversation. Just cold words blinking on her phone screen. She waited. A day. A week. A month. No papers came. No lawyers called. He vanished like a ghost, his silence louder than any courtroom decree. And in that silence, Amelia collapsed. She spent weeks hiding from the world, her voice hoarse from crying, her heart a battlefield of questions. How could love disappear so easily? How could she become invisible in a life she helped build? But grief, while cruel, has a strange way of chiseling away weakness. Somewhere in the thick of her despair, Amelia found fragments of herself, pieces that refused to break. She started small. Reading again. Taking long walks through Hyde Park. Picking up freelance editing jobs online just to feel useful. The world hadn't ended, it had simply changed its shape. And she would shape herself along with it. One evening, while working at a quiet cafe in Kensington, she met a man who noticed her scribbling edits on a manuscript. He asked about her work, her past in publishing, and the conversation naturally turned to her own unfinished story. She didn't mention Edward by name, but the man, Leon, listened with uncommon intensity. He offered her a contract to consult on branding for one of his investment firm's luxury ventures. A short project, he said. Nothing serious. But Amelia took it. And then another. And another. She didn't know who he really was then, just a polished man with sharp eyes and an accent she couldn't quite place. All she knew was that someone finally saw her again. Looking back now, she realized she had never truly been invisible. She had just been standing in the wrong light. And the woman who had once been reduced to a ghost was learning how to haunt with purpose. Isabel Montgomery had always known how to turn heads. Even before she was draped in designer gowns and splashed across glossy magazine pages as the woman beside the tech king, she understood the currency of attention. Charm was her weapon, ambition her compass. Born in Brighton to a modest family, Isabel grew up watching her mother work 2 jobs while her father disappeared into pubs. She vowed early that her life would look nothing like theirs. She studied hard, networked harder, and clawed her way into London's competitive PR world by 25. By 27, she was Edward Price's personal communications manager, tasked with polishing his public image, and quickly began imagining herself as a fixture in that image, too. It started subtly. Long hours alone in Edward's office, shared secrets over espresso, gentle touches that lingered too long. She learned to anticipate his moods, laugh at his jokes, echo his vision like a mirror. When Edward's gaze started to linger on her legs more than the marketing reports, Isabel leaned in, deliberately. She was sleek, driven, and always perfectly put together. She made herself indispensable to him, and when he began pulling away from his wife, Isabel was already poised to step into her place. Once Amelia vanished from the public eye, Isabel flourished in the spotlight. The media adored her. Articles described her as a modern-day muse and the secret behind Edward Price's golden era. She was seen front row at tech summits, whispering into Edward's ear at launch parties, jet-setting to Dubai, Paris, and New York with him like they were royalty. The business press treated her like she belonged. Fashion blogs fawned over her wardrobe. Influencers copied her sleek ponytails and bold lipsticks. She had crafted her role meticulously, Edward's advisor, lover, and future wife. But behind the polished Instagram photos and orchestrated interviews was a woman constantly battling shadows, especially one named Amelia. No one said her name, but Isabel could feel her presence in the corners of Edward's life. The dusty photo albums he never threw away. The locked drawer in his office he refused to open. The strange way he still flinched at mentions of the past. Isabel tried not to let it bother her, but it did. Deeply. She had one, hadn't she? Then why did it still feel incomplete? In private moments, Edward's detachment resurfaced. He was colder than she expected, less romantic than she dreamed. She blamed stress. She blamed the business. But somewhere deep inside, she feared it was something else, someone else. Amelia had been erased from the narrative, but not from Edward's psyche. And Isabel, for all her power, could feel it. Still, she clung to the belief that visibility meant victory. So, when Edward proposed in a quiet suite overlooking the Thames, she said yes with tears in her eyes and 100 reporters already tipped off for the next morning. The wedding plans began instantly, top-tier florists, custom couture, celebrity chefs, and a guest list that read like a Forbes gala. Claridge's ballroom was booked within hours. The wedding wouldn't just be a ceremony, it would be a statement. A PR masterpiece. A declaration to the world that she was the rightful queen beside the king. She told herself Amelia would never dare show up. She had vanished without a fight. She was a ghost, a footnote, a forgotten chapter. Isabel stood in front of the mirror in her silk robe days before the wedding, rehearsing her smile for the cameras. She had the man. The fame. The ring. Everything she had ever wanted. And yet, somewhere inside her, a sliver of unease remained. Because even when the spotlight was brightest, shadows still whispered. Leo Ashford was not a man who wasted words or time. In the world of international finance, where charm could be bought and sold as easily as assets, Leo preferred power that whispered rather than roared. He owned Ashford Global Capital, a multi-billion-pound investment firm that operated like a silent tide, slow, steady, and impossible to ignore. In his early 40s, Leo had the composed elegance of a man who had learned to bend chaos to his will. Sharp suits, sharper instincts, and a reputation for reading people like balance sheets. Years ago, he had briefly circled Edward Price's company, considering an acquisition. The deal fell through not because of price, but because Leo didn't like what he saw in Edward. Too impulsive. Too performative. Not sustainable. Leo walked away, but not without remembering the woman who sat silently in the boardroom corner, taking notes, her eyes burning with ideas that no one asked for. Amelia Price. Their paths crossed again by chance, or fate, at a Kensington cafe. Leo had recognized her immediately, though she looked different then. Quieter. Still healing. He noticed how she carried herself, as if she were afraid to take up too much space. But when they spoke, her intelligence was undeniable. She critiqued a branding campaign on his tablet without being asked, her notes precise, elegant, and brilliant. That conversation led to another. Then to work. Then to cautious friendship. Leo never pried about her past, but he listened when she offered pieces of it. And when the envelope arrived containing Edward's wedding invitation, Amelia didn't call a lawyer, she called Leo. He read the invitation once, handed it back, and said simply, "Do you want to go?" There was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity. Amelia hesitated, unsure if it was pride or pain stopping her. But then she met his eyes and said what she had been holding in for years. "He never divorced me. He left and pretended I didn't exist. I'm not here for revenge. I just want truth. In a room full of lies, I want to be the one thing that is real." Leo nodded. "Then let's give them reality." Within days, his legal team was assembled, 3 of London's most formidable attorneys, all briefed, all ruthless, all discreet. Paperwork was tracked. Dates and documents examined. Edward had made a fatal error in his arrogance. The marriage wasn't just emotionally broken, it was legally incomplete. And Leo, in his quiet precision, ensured every fact was airtight. He never told Amelia what he thought of Edward, though it was obvious. What he respected more was her restraint. Her clarity. Her refusal to stoop to spectacle. In a world obsessed with vengeance, Amelia only wanted truth, and Leo Ashford, a man of numbers and results, found that incredibly rare. So, he made her a promise: you walk into that wedding knowing you're not alone. You're not weak. And you're not forgotten. Amelia stood in front of the floor-length mirror inside a quiet boutique tucked away in Mayfair, the kind that catered to women of quiet means and powerful intentions. She had browsed racks of silk, chiffon, and satin for nearly an hour, the shop assistant fluttering politely in the background. Nothing had felt quite right, too soft, too pale, too apologetic. She wasn't there to mourn the past. She was there to confront it. And then she saw it. A gown in deep crimson, almost blood red, tucked between 2 sequined evening dresses. It didn't sparkle. It didn't beg for attention. It simply demanded it. She stepped into the fitting room and slid the dress on with steady hands. The silk hugged her curves with elegance, the neckline sharp but tasteful, the hem grazing the floor like it belonged in a different century. As she turned toward the mirror, the woman staring back at her didn't look broken. She looked like fire walking. The red whispered of rage and resurrection, of a woman who had endured enough and was done being erased. Crimson had never been her color. On her wedding day, she wore ivory lace with trembling hands, her face glowing with naive hope. That version of her was long gone. This dress was not about seduction or revenge, it was a declaration. She was not a ghost, not a scorned ex-wife, not a footnote in Edward's perfect narrative. She was walking proof that you could lose everything and still return stronger. Her fingers brushed the fabric lightly as memories surged back, most vividly, the days she sat across from Edward's attorneys during their initial property hearing. Back then, she had been too shocked, too confused to fight. They had tried to corner her into signing documents she hadn't read, pressured her into accepting a meager settlement, treating her like an inconvenient oversight in Edward's new life. And she, shaking, overwhelmed, emotionally wrecked, had said almost nothing. She had let them bulldoze her in silence, convinced it was easier to disappear than to resist. But not this time. This time, she had billionaire legal counsel behind her, but more importantly, she had something she hadn't had before, clarity. The kind that only comes after walking through hell and choosing not to set up home there. She was no longer interested in vindication through drama. She wasn't walking into Claridge's to ruin a wedding. She was walking in to remind everyone, especially Edward, that truth doesn't stay buried just because it's inconvenient. Amelia stepped out of the fitting room and caught the assistant's wide-eyed gaze. "We'll take it," she said, her voice calm but firm. The assistant nodded, clearly understanding the moment meant more than fashion. As she left the boutique with the red gown carefully wrapped in layers of tissue, Amelia didn't feel fear. She felt ready. The kind of ready that came from shedding your skin and stepping back into the world, not as a victim, but as the author of your own next chapter. Claridge's ballroom glittered like a jewel box that afternoon, a stage set for a spectacle rather than a wedding. Crystal chandeliers spilled light across silk-draped tables, each one adorned with towering arrangements of white orchids and blush roses. A custom floral arch crowned the altar, and a quartet played softly beneath a canopy of fairy lights. It was the wedding of the year, already trending on social media before the bride had even arrived. Guests were carefully curated, tech giants, media personalities, fashion bloggers, investors. Paparazzi waited outside like hungry wolves. Edward Price's second chapter was about to be immortalized, and every click, every lens, every post had been orchestrated to perfection. Isabel Montgomery made her entrance 30 minutes late, as planned, stepping into the ballroom like it was her runway. Her gown was sheer couture, champagne silk woven with crystals that caught every glint of light. Her hair swept back into a sleek chignon, her lips a careful nude, her diamond earrings swinging just enough to whisper wealth. The room collectively turned toward her, gasps and murmurs rising as if she were a monarch. She smiled, radiant, smug, composed. This was the moment she had imagined for years. The day she would stand beside Edward not as a mistress, but as a wife. Edward stood at the altar in a dark, custom-made tuxedo, exuding calm. If he was nervous, he didn't show it. His posture was stiff, jaw tight, but that was his usual demeanor when the cameras were on. He gave Isabel a small nod as she approached, and the officiant stepped forward with a carefully prepared script. Everything was proceeding perfectly, every detail rehearsed. Then, just as the officiant asked the guests to rise, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. There was a subtle shift in energy, like a breath being held. The doors at the back of the ballroom creaked open, not hurriedly, not forcefully, but deliberately. Every head turned. Whispers bloomed like wildfire. The string quartet faltered, the officiant's voice caught mid-sentence, and the entire room fell into stunned silence. Amelia Price stepped through the threshold in her crimson gown, her presence slicing through the opulence like a blade. The red was jarring against the soft tones of the room, commanding attention without apology. Her hair was pinned into an elegant twist, her eyes steady and unflinching. On either side of her stood three sharply dressed attorneys, And just behind them, Leo Ashford, unmistakable in his tailored navy suit and measured expression. The gasp that rose from the crowd was collective and involuntary. Phones were lowered. Cameras froze. Edward turned slowly, confusion knitting into horror. Isabel's smile faltered. Her grip on the bouquet tightened, knuckles white against pale pink roses. No one said a word, but the silence roared. Amelia took slow, deliberate steps down the aisle, her heels clicking on marble, her posture regal. She wasn't rushing, wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Her very presence was the interruption. She stopped just before the altar, her eyes never leaving Edward's. "You may want to pause the ceremony," she said, voice calm but ringing clear. "Because this man is still married. To me." Gasps turned to murmurs. The officiant backed away slightly. Isabel's face paled as her perfect day unraveled in real time. Edward looked like a man watching his empire sink. Behind Amelia, Leo stood silently, an immovable force, while the attorneys each held folders of documentation, ready to do what they came for. The truth had arrived. In red. Gasps echoed through Claridge's ballroom like a thunderclap trapped in crystal. For a full breathless moment, no one moved. Amelia's voice, cool, composed, unwavering, hung in the air like a verdict. Edward Price, the man of the hour, took a small step back, his expression cracking for the first time that evening. His brows knitted, his lips parted, but no words came. He looked not at Amelia, but at Isabel, who now stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet trembling slightly in her grip. The golden light that once made her shimmer now made her look washed out, pale, brittle, stunned. "You never legally divorced me," Amelia repeated, her voice slicing through the hushed crowd. "You sent a text, Edward. A single message. No papers. No filings. No signatures. You walked away and assumed I'd disappear. But the law doesn't work on assumptions." Edward opened his mouth, eyes darting toward the rows of important guests, his investors, his board members, the elite media he had so carefully courted. "That's not possible," he stammered, trying to recover. "There must have been. I had someone handle it. My attorney." Amelia stepped forward, just slightly. From behind her, one of the three lawyers calmly opened a leather folder and handed her a document. She held it up for Edward to see, the embossed letterhead catching the light. "This is the official search of the court records," she said. "There is no divorce filing. Not in London. Not in New York. Not anywhere. And unless you manage to file in a country that doesn't exist, Edward, that means you are still married to me." The lawyer beside her, Elaine Mercer, a senior partner with Ashford Legal, stepped forward. "We have full documentation. Bank statements, legal correspondences, real estate contracts signed jointly after your so-called separation. Your failure to file renders any subsequent marriage a legal violation. If you proceed with this ceremony, Mr. Price, you could be facing charges of bigamy." Isabel's breath hitched audibly. She turned to Edward, eyes wide with disbelief. "You told me it was done," she whispered, horror climbing into her voice. "You said it was finished." Edward's jaw clenched. "I thought it was. I paid someone to take care of it." His voice cracked as realization dawned, this wasn't just a scandal. This was the collapse of everything he'd built. In the front row, one of his top investors stood, exchanging a glance with another before quietly stepping out. The cracks had begun. Amelia didn't gloat. She didn't shout or cry or scream. She simply stood there, tall and composed, the embodiment of grace sharpened by betrayal. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't rise. She had no interest in spectacle. Only truth. And truth, on this day, wore red. Behind her, Leo Ashford remained silent, his arms crossed lightly, eyes fixed on Edward with a calm, calculating stare. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone, a billionaire with more power in his stillness than Edward had ever had in motion, was enough to send a message. You messed with the wrong woman. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. Phones were back in hands. Pictures snapped quietly, videos already uploading to social media. The wedding of the year had become the scandal of the decade, and it was all real. Amelia turned to the officiant, offering a polite nod. "You may want to call this off," she said quietly. "There's no wedding here. Only unfinished business." And with that, she stepped back, leaving behind a silence so deep it could only mean one thing: the truth had finally taken the stage. The silence didn't last long. It never did when scandal rippled through the upper crust of London's elite. Within seconds, the room erupted. Reporters who had come expecting soft soundbites and celebratory photos surged forward with raised microphones and flashing cameras, shouting questions over one another. "Is it true you're still married, Mr. Price? Who is the woman in red? Did you commit fraud?" The press had smelled blood, and they were ravenous. Edward raised a hand to shield his face, his composure evaporating under the harsh lights and harsher scrutiny. His board members, seated in the front row, no longer masked their disapproval. One of them, a silver-haired investor with decades in the tech industry, rose to his feet and muttered to the man beside him, "I warned them, never mix PR with personal disasters." The other nodded, already pulling out his phone. Damage control had begun, but it was far too late. At the altar, Isabel stood trembling, humiliated in front of the cameras and the crowd she had spent months cultivating. Her flawless makeup began to crack as the truth sank in. The whispered conversations behind closed doors, Edward's refusal to show her the divorce decree, the guarded look in his eyes whenever Amelia's name came up, it all made sense now. She turned toward him, her voice breaking. "You lied to me," she said, not as an accusation but a realization. Then she threw her bouquet, once a symbol of her victory, onto the marble floor and stormed down the aisle, pushing past the photographers. Her heels clicked furiously, echoing through the ballroom as she vanished through the grand doors, a trail of shame in her wake. The fairy tale had shattered. Amelia remained still, steady amid the chaos. She reached into the folder her lawyer held and pulled out one final set of papers, copies of the legal documents confirming Edward's failure to dissolve their marriage, stamped and notarized. She walked forward slowly and placed them into Edward's hands. "These belong to you," she said, voice low but lethal. "So does the truth. You should carry it for once." Edward stared at her, speechless, humiliated. The room that had once applauded him now whispered in disgust. Everything he'd tried to bury had come back to the surface, and Amelia hadn't raised her voice once. Leo Ashford stepped beside Edward and leaned in, his voice barely above a murmur but sharp enough to slice through pride. "You should have never underestimated her," he said, with the calm of a man who had seen it all and would remember this moment forever. In the back of the room, a young influencer, barely out of university, had been recording since Amelia first stepped through the doors. She uploaded the clip to TikTok within minutes. By the time Amelia and Leo exited the ballroom with her lawyers in tow, the video already had over 100,000 views. The caption read, "Wife in red crashes wedding, exposes groom for still being married, skullfire #wedding fail #legendary." And just like that, Amelia Price went from forgotten to unforgettable. In the days that followed the public humiliation at Claridge's, Edward Price scrambled to salvage what was left of his carefully curated reputation. Press releases were issued, spokespeople deployed, and a carefully crafted narrative spun. Mr. Price had indeed initiated divorce proceedings, but due to unforeseen legal delays, the process remained incomplete. The message was clear: Edward was a victim of bureaucratic error, not deceit. He held press conferences where his voice was calm, rehearsed, and full of regret, portraying himself as a wronged man caught in unfortunate circumstances. Yet, behind closed doors, his legal team was on the defensive, scrambling to find evidence that might save his name and his empire. But Leo Ashford and his team were not interested in half-truths or damage control. Within a week, Amelia's lawyers filed a comprehensive lawsuit that shook the foundations of Edward's business and personal life. The suit detailed charges of public fraud for knowingly entering a second marriage without a valid divorce, emotional abuse in the breakdown of their relationship, and asset concealment, highlighting joint accounts, properties, and business dealings that Edward had attempted to hide. The allegations were meticulous, backed by months of investigation and airtight documentation. Amelia herself added a critical component to the legal battle, a claim for her rightful share of Edward's company. Though she had left the marriage years before, her early contributions were undeniable. She had helped build the brand, negotiated initial contracts, and had been an active partner in the fledgling startup's formative years. The claim was not just about money, it was a statement of recognition and respect. Amelia was no longer invisible, no longer a ghost. The courtroom drama unfolded over several intense weeks. Media coverage was relentless, turning the trial into a spectacle rivaling any reality show. But Amelia remained the calm center amid the storm. She sat quietly, her posture perfect, her gaze steady as Edward's lawyers tried every tactic, from questioning her motives to attacking her character. Edward himself appeared more brittle with each passing day. The confident tycoon who once ruled boardrooms was reduced to defensive outbursts and pleading for understanding. He stumbled over his own words, contradicted witnesses, and faltered under cross-examination. Amelia never wavered. She answered every question with measured honesty, refusing to be baited into anger or tears. She was clear, concise, and resolute. The jury, the judge, and the public saw a woman who had been wronged but refused to be broken. After days of deliberation, the court delivered its verdict. Amelia Price was still legally Edward Price's wife. The attempted second marriage was declared null and void. More importantly, the court awarded Amelia a controlling stake in Edward's company, recognizing her contributions and affirming her rights as a partner. The decision sent shockwaves through the business community. Edward was effectively ousted from his own empire, forced to answer to the woman he had tried to erase. The courtroom buzzed with the gravity of the moment as Amelia rose from her seat. There was no triumphant smile, no gloating glance. Just quiet dignity. Outside, reporters clamored for statements, but Amelia chose only to say, "Justice isn't about revenge, it's about truth." Leo Ashford stood beside her, his quiet nod a seal of support. In that moment, the world saw what Amelia had known all along. She was not a forgotten wife. She was a force to be reckoned with. After the courtroom verdict, Edward Price's world began to unravel with terrifying speed. The company board, once loyal to his vision and leadership, convened emergency meetings behind closed doors. Investors who had once praised his brilliance now questioned his judgment and integrity. The board voted unanimously to remove him as CEO, citing breach of trust and failure to disclose critical legal issues. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and headlines was now a fallen titan, ousted from the empire he had built on shaky foundations. Meanwhile, Isabel Montgomery vanished from the public eye. The socialite who had basked in the spotlight and reveled in her newfound status was nowhere to be found. Paparazzi staked out her usual haunts, only to be met with silence and shuttered windows. Rumors swirled, some said she left London altogether, others whispered of private therapy and emotional breakdowns. Whatever the truth, her chapter in Edward's story had closed, leaving behind only whispers of scandal and heartbreak. Amid the fallout, Edward did something unexpected. He wrote Amelia a letter. The envelope arrived at her office, unmarked but unmistakable. Inside, his words were raw and unpolished, an admission of mistakes, regrets, and a tentative hope for dialogue. He asked for a meeting, not to rekindle love or plead forgiveness, but to face the consequences together, to acknowledge what had been lost, and perhaps find closure. Amelia read the letter twice before replying. She agreed to meet, not out of lingering feelings, but from a place of strength and finality. When they met in a quiet, neutral cafe, the air was thick with history and unspoken pain. Edward looked older, wearier, his pride tempered by defeat. Amelia listened patiently as he spoke, then gently interrupted. "I don't hate you," she said quietly, her eyes steady on his. "I'm just finally done shrinking for you." It was a powerful declaration, one that acknowledged the years of silence and sacrifice, the way she had made herself smaller to fit into his world. Now, she stood tall, no longer willing to fade into the background of his life or anyone else's. She had reclaimed her voice, her identity, and her future. Edward nodded slowly, understanding that some wounds could not be undone, and some bridges could only be crossed when both parties were ready. For Amelia, this meeting wasn't about redemption for him, it was about reclaiming her own peace. As they parted, Amelia walked away with her head held high, knowing she had closed one chapter and was ready to write the next, on her own terms. 1 year after the storm that rocked London's elite, Amelia Price's life had transformed in ways she had never imagined. The woman who once sat silently in the shadows of a broken marriage now stood firmly in the light, a beacon for those who had suffered in silence. With Leo Ashford's unwavering support and the backing of influential allies, Amelia had founded the Phoenix Foundation, a women's legal organization dedicated to empowering forgotten wives, abandoned partners, and survivors of emotional and financial abuse. The foundation was more than a charity, it was a movement, a lifeline for countless women who had been erased, dismissed, or cast aside by society. Amelia's days were filled with meetings with top lawyers, strategists, and social advocates. She tirelessly championed legal reforms, crafted educational programs, and coordinated community outreach initiatives that spanned continents. Each success story, a woman reclaiming her rights, a family reunited, a legacy restored, fueled her resolve. Amelia understood firsthand how isolating betrayal could be, how devastating it was to lose not just a partner but your sense of self. Now, she wielded her experience like armor, transforming pain into purpose. Her voice, once soft and hesitant, had become a steady force in conferences and public forums. Yet, despite the growing media attention, Amelia remained grounded and focused. She shunned the spotlight that had once belonged to Edward and Isabel. Instead, she built quietly, deliberately, letting her work speak volumes. She cultivated a reputation not for drama or spectacle, but for integrity, resilience, and tangible change. Her partnership with Leo Ashford evolved beyond their initial alliance. He became a mentor and trusted friend, sharing his vast network and business acumen. Together, they nurtured the foundation's growth, ensuring that it had the resources and reach to make a lasting impact. Leo often said Amelia's strength was rare, born not from privilege, but from adversity, and he admired how she carried herself with grace amid the storms. On this particular day, Amelia found herself in a sleek glass skyscraper in Dubai, preparing to close a deal that would mark a new milestone for the Phoenix Foundation. The $50 million investment was the largest yet, set to fund expansion into the Middle East and North Africa, regions where women's legal rights faced immense challenges. As she walked into the boardroom, the familiar weight of anticipation settled over her, but it no longer intimidated her. She was ready. Her dress was crimson once more, a deliberate choice. The same deep red that had announced her arrival at Claridge's, that had become her symbol of power, passion, and rebirth. The fabric flowed over her frame with elegance and authority, commanding attention without demanding it. The executives waiting for her greeted her with respect. They knew the story behind the woman in red and the strength she represented. The meeting was intense, full of questions and negotiations, but Amelia navigated each moment with poise. Her words were clear, her vision unwavering. She spoke not just as a founder but as someone who understood the stakes on a deeply personal level. When the final contract was signed, hands shaken, and cameras discreetly clicked, the room seemed to exhale in collective admiration. As she stepped out of the skyscraper into the warm Dubai afternoon, Amelia allowed herself a small smile. The journey from that rainy London day to this moment had been arduous, filled with heartbreak, fight, and fierce determination. Yet, here she was, not as a victim, but as a victor. She thought back to the man who tried to erase her, to the wedding she crashed, to the courtroom battles and sleepless nights. They had believed she was finished, buried beneath their lies and betrayals. But she had not been broken. She had been planting roots. With her head held high, Amelia Price walked forward into her future, a future she had claimed for herself, painted boldly in shades of red. The world might have thought they had seen the last of her, but she was just beginning to bloom. They thought I was buried. But I was just planting roots.